SECfans.com. You thought we left you forever. We just took a break in the off season. I've got Husky Pup with me once again. We are back because a little something happened last week. I think it was the NFL draft. It was, and this is a great time to talk about it. We're in the off season. We're through the spring games, and now we've got a little bit of meat to chew on, and that is a discussion of not only what we saw in the draft, but how this is going to affect teams in the SEC going into the 2017 season, and maybe a little discussion about who to look for in 2018. So let's get into it. First, I want to thank everybody, obviously, always, YouTube and the podcast, and this is probably going to be a long one, so if you want to hear the whole thing, you don't have time to watch the whole thing on YouTube, then check out the podcast at secfans.com. It's the same audio that we're going to have in the video here. I know a lot of people like to listen to us in their car, so that's always a good choice. So getting right into it, going to talk about the draft first, a little bit of a general discussion. Husky, tell me what you think in terms of what we saw in this draft, in the 2017 draft, in terms of how it reflects on not only the team that these players came from, and maybe talk about that, and also the perception of what it's going to do to that team going forward. And maybe to put a finer point on that, if a team loses a lot of people in the draft, is it safe to assume that they're going to suck the next year because they got to replace a lot of top tier talent? So I know there's about 107 questions to get you started, and you're probably still rusty, but go ahead and jump in those, whichever order you want to answer them, and let's get going.
The reality of the draft is it is sort of a double-edged sword, I think. When you have a lot of players go in the draft, obviously that means you're losing a lot of talent. But it also means that there's a certain amount of respect from the NFL for the talent that you lost. So, in a nutshell, I think long term, you're always good to have a lot of guys go in the draft because it does genuinely affect recruiting. It is a sign of the fact that you're able to develop players, that everything is going well, that you're bringing in good talent. That's all a good long term healthy thing. And it, again, because of the recruiting perspective, I think it kind of snowballs and it builds on itself. The flip side to that argument is when you have a lot of guys going in the draft, that also means that you lost a lot of talent. Now, the way I've always looked at it is you kind of want your talent loss to be commensurate with the success that you had. In other words, if you were a playoff team, you probably had a lot of talent on your squad, and that's, to be expected that you lost a lot of guys in the draft, or that you had a good quote unquote draft. I also think it's often a good sign if you have a team that's very successful and doesn't have a lot of draftable players, because at the end of the day, that means you coached your guys well. You did really well with the pieces you had. It's a good sign of the coaching staff. Now, again, it's a good sign that you were able to accomplish as much as you did with the talent you had. Maybe it's a sign that your coaching staff isn't doing a very good job of getting talent into your program, but at least you had a successful season with a talent level. What I think is really bad is if you have a team that did not achieve a high level of, success in a given season, and they have a lot of guys drafted. I mean, that's a bad thing.
So give me an example off the top of your head. I know we didn't discuss this ahead of time, and for those of y'all who are wondering, we're kind of just, I don't know, a little free will in this one. We're not pre-planning this discussion. We're just kind of seeing where it takes us. And so I'm going to drop a surprise question on you. I kind of had an idea that's where you're going to go in terms of your answer. But I want to know in this draft, maybe now, maybe in years prior, what's a good example of a team that illustrates the point you just made, where a team that has a lot of talent go in the draft, but it reflects poorly on that team or maybe that coaching staff because they didn't get it done on the field?
I think maybe a good example this year is probably Miami. I think Miami had the third most players drafted. They had 8 players drafted in the draft this year. Ended up with a 9-4 record, which isn't bad, but that 9-4 record only actually had one ranked win. And I think, I'd already looked this up actually, because I thought this was a really interesting statistic. A lot of people are kind of, I guess, critical end of the year about Kirby Smart. They had an 8-5 record. Some people had high expectations, but Georgia had one draftable player from this past season. They had one guy get drafted, and that was Isaiah McKenzie, the smallish receiver that they used to do a million things. Some of it, like the Vanderbilt attempted conversion, was a little questionable, but you kind of see why they did that when you realize he was the only guy that got drafted off that roster. And Mark Richt, who people look at and go, "Oh, we'll see. Look at the success he had at Miami. And he had 8 guys drafted." So, it, personally, I think a really good example is Miami, and I think the perception of where they are and where they're headed under Mark Richt, maybe you need to take a step back, especially since he's a first-year coach. I mean, let's understand, Mark Richt didn't suddenly, in the 8 months he was there, teach all these guys how to play football, such that they could be drafted as NFL prospects. Most of every development they had going into this past season. So, with that in mind, Mark Richt actually inherited a pretty darn good team with, almost half the starting roster being draft ready players immediately. And then he had what ended up being a pretty promising, ending up being just merely averagely successful season. And on the flip side, everybody's critical of Kirby Smart, but Mark Richt left Kirby Smart with a team that was almost totally devoid of NFL ready draftable talent. And I think that's a pretty good example of, maybe Georgia fans are disappointed at their draft, but I wouldn't look at it that way. I would look at it and say, Kirby Smart did a really good job what we had. We didn't lose as much as maybe we might have thought we would going into the season. And likewise, I think maybe Miami fans should take a step back and realize they're losing a lot more than you would expect to lose off a team with their record from last year.
And I think, it maybe veers a little bit away from the draft, but Georgia fans may have had a little too high of an expectation with the first year of Kirby Smart. I think they were thinking that they were fully loaded with talent and that Rick was the problem, not the talent that he left him with. But some of that can be attributed to the fact that you might recruit great. You might be a 5-star city, but those 5 stars become 3 stars really fast once they're not developed, by that coaching staff. Do you think that's some of what we saw at Georgia under Mark Richt, based on what you just said and based on what we saw in the draft?
A little bit, yeah. I think they have sort of been trending down. Georgia has a large number of players. I think fourth or fifth in the NFL number of NFL players, which is kind of crazy when you think about the fact that they haven't, as much as they've been really, really good and been close, they haven't really truly accomplished, line item championship sort of things very much in the past 15 years. And a lot of that, I honestly think, is Richt and his development. I mean, they've lost a lot of players just to general attrition. They constantly having guys suspended. They just had another highly touted running back, right, that on their roster that got popped for weed, and now he's going to be suspended indefinitely. And I mean, it's a guy that's not panning out, but I mean, that's kind of the story for Georgia sometimes, is that they get these guys that don't really pan out, don't really go anywhere, and especially you look at all the secondary players. You got guys like Trey Matthews starting for Auburn. That was a very highly touted recruit that signed with Georgia. And, Nick Marshall, another highly touted defensive back, ended up playing quarterback at Auburn. So, yeah, I do think it comes into play. I think it personally reflects poorly on Mark Richt. I know a lot of people love him. I'm sure he's a great guy from everything I've heard. But I am a very strong believer that you have to be very careful with programs like this because teams trend in a direction up or down. And if you wait to fire somebody until you're already at one end or the other of that spectrum, it does a tremendous amount of damage. I think Arkansas, when they came off Petrino and they got John L. Smith, and they kind of thought they'd float for a year. Petrino hadn't been recruiting well. John L. Smith sort of tanked him. And
Arkansas fans
now,
already don't like us, and now you're reminding them of John L. Smith. Come on, man.
well, what I'm saying here though is I don't think people give enough credit to where they were at when Belima started with that job, and I think they're actually getting better slowly but surely. They're building up that program a little bit. But another example I think is probably Missouri right now. I think if you're Missouri, you have to be extremely careful because they did have a lot of results prior, but now under the current coaching staff, you got to really question it. They're not. I mean, they were never recruited great, but I'm not even sure they're finding the sort of gems they used to find, and the results aren't there. And at some point, And it only takes a few years. If you let yourself get to the point where you're winning 2 games a season or something, it's very difficult to climb out of that hole.
And if you're in Missouri, is there any way? Because I feel like there's some teams who send guys to the NFL. I'm not talking about the Alabamas and the LSU's of the world, but there are teams out there that tend to send players into the NFL, and they kind of have that level of consistency, and they can build on that. Is Missouri sending Charles Harris in the first round? I think it was like 22nd pick. Is that something that they can build on recruiting, or is it one of those one-offs that is you're losing a good player and you're not going to be able to backfill with that talent because it's not something you can build on?
It's an interesting question. I mean, it's notable that that's their only pick in the draft, right? But I don't know how much it helps them considering the recruiting has never been great. It's not like they've ever signed tons of 5-star pass rushers, yet they seem to produce them. And if you go way back and look at my preview for last year, my whole discussion of Missouri was I felt like the remarkable success they'd had in taking kind of no-name players and turning them into NFL draft picks wasn't sustainable. That the reality is it's always a crapshoot with these 3 stars, and the reality is a lot of 3 stars are going to end up being draft NFL players, and something like half the first round every year ends up being 3-star players. But the other side of it is that for every 4-star, there are something like 100 3-stars, and for every 5-star, it's even higher, more of a proportion. So it's always a bit of a dice roll, and it's like going to a roulette. I always use a roulette analogy that people say, let's hit black 3 times. I'm going to roll black again. And, the truth is that's not at all how it works. It doesn't matter how many times it's hit black. It may have hit the last 7 times. You still got a 50-50 shot if it's red or black this time. And I think it's sort of the same thing. I mean, when you consider the fact that the recruiting hasn't been great, that doesn't make me think it's going to have a huge impact on recruiting. And I don't think it's any indication that they have some sort of magic crystal ball that they can tell they have elite talent. And I don't know, at least they didn't lose a ton of guys that were super talented. They just lost that one dude, but that one dude was probably the most talented player on a team that
Right.
wasn't very good otherwise. So, I mean, Missouri is not in great shape as a program, and I'm very concerned about that program.